Other famous personalities are seen befriending the embattled couple, including entertainment mogul Tyler Perry, who offered up his Beverly Hills mansion to Meghan and Harry without having ever met them in person.
I was just a wreck. I was just crying and crying.
In the documentary, Perry states he offered to help because he believed Meghan was being emotionally abused by the palace and British media.
Tyler Perry isn't the kind of man who makes drama. He's the guy who helps quietly, gives generously, and moves without ever needing the spotlight. But when he stepped onto that stage at the BET Awards, the industry felt it. Something had changed. His words didn't name names, but the message cut like a blade. And for anyone who knew the history, it was obvious who it was meant for: Meghan Markle. What started as a silent act of kindness in 2020 had unraveled into a public fallout that no one saw coming. The mogul who once offered her safety, shelter, and trust had reached his breaking point. And when he spoke, the walls around Meghan's carefully crafted image began to collapse. But this wasn't just about a speech. It was the first domino in a chain reaction that would upend deals, shatter reputations, and reveal a side of Meghan that had been whispered about, but never confirmed until now. In 2020, when Harry and Meghan publicly cut ties with the British royal family, the world watched with fascination and judgment. The headlines called it a modern fairy tale gone rogue, but behind the media frenzy was a reality no one wanted to acknowledge. The couple had no home, no security, and no solid plan. They were effectively stranded, unwanted by the institution they left behind, and unsure of their place in the world they were re-entering. That's when Tyler Perry, a man with no royal connections and no obligation to intervene, made a private call that would change everything. He offered them the keys to his sprawling $18 million estate in Beverly Hills. Not just a guest house or temporary suite, his actual mansion. On top of that, he paid for round-the-clock security, covered living expenses, and insured the press. Couldn't touch them. In a moment where they had nothing, Perry gave them everything. No contracts, no conditions. Just help from someone who understood what it felt like to be scrutinized, misjudged, and emotionally cornered by the spotlight. At the time, Perry kept quiet. He didn't chase interviews or post about his generosity. He believed in helping people privately, especially people who were, in his eyes, hurting. And in the beginning, Meghan and Harry seemed genuinely grateful. There were long conversations, late-night heart-to-hearts, even talks about how to rebuild their lives with purpose. It felt like a bond, not a favor. Perry wasn't just a host. He was a friend. But as the dust settled and the Netflix cameras rolled, something shifted. The calls became less frequent. The connection cooled. Months went by without even a check-in. There were no thank yous, no gestures of appreciation. Not even acknowledgement when Meghan publicly recounted that season of her life. She spoke about a friend who had helped them, but never said his name. For Perry, who had opened not just his home, but his life, the omission felt telling. Those close to him say he brushed it off at first. After all, not everyone expresses gratitude the same way. But as time passed and Harry and Meghan's brand skyrocketed into million-dollar deals and global press tours, Perry was still waiting for something simple: recognition. Instead, what he got was silence. Not just absence, but distance. A growing feeling that he'd been a stepping stone in a larger narrative, one that no longer needed him once the cameras found better lighting. And that silence, Perry would later tell friends, was louder than any betrayal, because it wasn't about money or fame, it was about trust. And the slow realization that maybe, just maybe, it had been one-sided from the start. It was a simple favor. At least that's how Meghan framed it. She reached out to Perry with a request: access to his private jet. No explanation, no discussion about logistics, no mention of cost, just a message that made it sound routine. Like she was borrowing a sweater, not a $50 million aircraft with staff, fuel, and scheduling involved. To anyone else, it might have been laughable, but Perry didn't laugh. He paused. This wasn't the first time Meghan had leaned on him, but something about this moment felt different. She wasn't asking out of need, not anymore. She was asking out of expectation, like his generosity had become a given, not a gift. Perry declined politely, not because he couldn't afford it, not because it was inconvenient, but because it finally felt like the line had been crossed. The moment he set a boundary, the tone changed. According to insiders, Meghan lashed out. She was cold, clipped, and accusatory. There was no curiosity, no grace, no space for understanding. Just backlash. It caught Perry off guard. After everything he had done, the housing, the security, the silence, this was the response. That was the moment he knew something had shifted, not just in the relationship, but in how she saw him. What? he thought was friendship now felt like a transaction gone sour, and that one conversation, that jet request, became the quiet fracture that turned into a rupture. From that point on, Perry started pulling back, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation, because he was starting to see a pattern, one that others in her orbit had already warned him about. Tyler Perry wasn't the first to feel it. He was just the first to say it out loud. Long before that private jet request, quiet warnings had been circulating through the industry. Colleagues, staffers, even producers began nudging Perry behind. The scenes. They weren't dramatic. They were careful. They'd seen what happened to people who questioned Meghan's choices. Still, the message was clear. Be careful. Meghan doesn't repay favors. She collects them. At first, Perry didn't believe it. He defended her, told people she was under pressure, misunderstood, trying to navigate a world that constantly judged her. He pushed back when people said she used people and dropped them. He gave her the benefit of the doubt again and again, but slowly, the pattern started revealing itself. A friend who once called daily now disappeared unless she needed something. Staffers who had gone above and beyond for the couple were suddenly out of the picture. Dismissed, blocked, erased. Producers who had bent over backward to accommodate her vision found themselves ghosted once the contract was signed. One by one, stories piled up, not from tabloids, but from people Perry trusted. They told him what they'd seen, how Meghan kept her circle tight and transactional, how she demanded loyalty but rarely returned it, how she expected unconditional support, even when it crossed professional lines. They told him it wasn't personal, it was pattern, charm followed by control, warmth followed by silence. Still, Perry hesitated. He didn't want to believe it. He still saw her as someone he'd helped in a moment of chaos, someone trying to start over. But with every ignored message, every unacknowledged gesture, it became harder to lie to himself. Because while Meghan's world kept growing, new deals, new platforms, new headlines, Perry was left standing in the shadows of a friendship that suddenly felt more like a favor bank she'd emptied and abandoned. Tyler Perry didn't raise his voice. He didn't drop names. He didn't need to when he took the stage at the 25th BET Awards. The room expected celebration, not confrontation. But what they got was something else entirely. In just a few sentences, Perry cracked open a carefully guarded truth. No theatrics, just precision. Some folks borrow blessings like they're owed, but never return the favor, he said. The line landed soft, but the meaning hit hard. No one was named, but everyone knew. There was no camera cut to Meghan, no gas from the crowd. Just a shared silence, the kind that only follows a truth everyone recognizes but no one wants to say. For the first time, the most generous man in Hollywood was drawing a boundary in public, and the person on the other side of that boundary had built a brand around being misunderstood and silenced. But Perry wasn't the media. He wasn't the monarchy. He was the one who opened his doors, protected her privacy, shielded her from chaos, and now he was done. Insiders say Perry hadn't planned to go public. For years, he bit his tongue, he ignored the warnings, he swallowed the resentment. But something about that final straw, the private jet, the name drop in that funding meeting, the complete absence of gratitude, made him realize this wasn't just a friendship gone cold. It was a narrative being built on his silence. He shattered the silence. It didn't come with anger. That's what made it dangerous. It came with calm, with clarity, with finality. It came from someone who had nothing left to lose and no interest in protecting a myth that had drained him for years. And in that moment, Tyler Perry's speech didn't just shift the mood, it shifted the industry. Because if someone like Perry, respected, powerful, and notoriously private, was done protecting Meghan Markle, who else was about to step forward? The reaction wasn't slow, it was immediate. Hours after Perry's quiet bombshell at the BET Awards, the ripple effects started to show. Not in gossip blogs, but in boardrooms. One producer tied to Meghan and Harry's latest Netflix project withdrew support the next morning. No calls, no explanation. Just a text that read, "I don't want to be involved in something that feels this toxic." Another investor who had already sat through 2 planning meetings with Meghan's team pulled out by noon. The money was moving, but now it was moving away. This wasn't about the content of their next documentary or the politics of Perry's speech. It was about trust. And Perry's decision to speak out had cracked the illusion that had protected Meghan's brand for years. If he, the man who gave them a literal home when no one else would, was now stepping away, what did? that say to the rest of Hollywood? The answer was loud, even in silence. Meghan's name, once a high-value signal for platforms trying to look progressive, inclusive, and culturally relevant, suddenly looked like a liability. What used to attract headlines was now inviting hesitation. Meetings were postponed, emails went unanswered. Suddenly, there was space. Too much of it. Back at Archewell, the scramble began. The team was caught off guard. No one expected Perry, of all people, to break ranks. His image had always been quiet strength, loyal, behind the scenes, never messy, and now he was the one dragging everything into the light. But this wasn't just a PR nightmare. It was the beginning of a financial unraveling. Partnerships Meghan and Harry had been nurturing behind closed doors were suddenly up in the air. Production schedules went into pause mode. Even internal hires were frozen. Because the thing about Hollywood is, it rarely takes sides, but it always watches who the power players are standing behind. And in one speech, Perry made it clear he was no longer in her corner. Meghan's team moved fast, but not smart. Within 48 hours of Tyler Perry's speech, calls went out to media contacts. A narrative had to be reshaped fast. Journalists were offered exclusives. Outlets were pitched emotional rebuttals. There were whispers of a podcast episode in the works. Meghan's side of the story, complete with behind-the-scenes clips and carefully edited voice notes. One insider even claimed her team floated the idea of doing a sit-down with a sympathetic talk show host to reframe Perry as out of touch and emotionally reactive, but none of it stuck. Reporters passed. Producers didn't bite. If anything, the sudden media blitz felt like exactly what it was. Panic, desperate attempts to control a narrative that had already slipped out of their hands. Instead of clearing the air, it raised more questions. Why was she pushing so hard? What was she trying to hide? And perhaps most damaging of all, Oprah stayed silent. For years, Meghan had counted Oprah among her most powerful allies. Their 2021 interview helped reset her public image. But when Perry went public, Oprah's camp offered nothing. No defense, no clarification, no comment, just distance. Quiet, deliberate, telling distance. The silence from Oprah echoed louder than any tweet or press release. Because if Meghan's strongest media ally wouldn't vouch for her, who would? Behind the scenes, the pressure was mounting. Meghan's inner circle was reportedly unraveling. Emails turned frantic. Staff grew cautious. Internal comms shifted from strategy to survival mode. And Perry, he remained calm and silent. He didn't follow up his speech with press appearances or social media threads. He didn't need to. He'd already said everything he needed to say, and now he was watching the world finally catch up. For a while, Tyler Perry tried to stay quiet. He waited. He replayed the moments. He listened when people told him to let it go, that it wasn't worth the drama. But there's a difference between letting something go and watching your name be used like a bargaining chip. And that's exactly what pushed him over the edge. In early 2024, Meghan reportedly name-dropped Perry in a closed-door pitch meeting for her new media venture. She casually suggested he was a silent backer, someone who believed in the project and would be part of its future. The move wasn't cleared, he hadn't been asked, and more importantly, it wasn't true. Word got back to Perry within days. He was furious, not because his name was mentioned, but because it was weaponized, used to gain access to a funding circle that would have likely opened its checkbooks based on his reputation alone. It wasn't a miscommunication, it was a move. Strategic, calculated, entitled, and for Perry, that was it. Sources close to him said he'd spent months debating whether to speak out, not to stir controversy, but to protect his own reputation. Because every time Meghan dropped his name, she wasn't just borrowing credibility, she was putting him on the line for decisions he hadn't made. His silence, once an act of grace, had become a liability. And in Hollywood, silence doesn't always read as kindness. Sometimes it reads as consent, so he chose the only stage where people would actually listen. A live mic, a public crowd, a statement that didn't need her name to land exactly where he wanted it. And the moment he opened that door, other people started stepping through. A former assistant from Meghan's team described the workplace as emotionally draining. Producers from her now defunct Spotify deal called her impossible to collaborate with and obsessed with control. Even members of Oprah's camp, once her loudest defenders, began distancing themselves in silence. Perry's speech hadn't created the storm, it just gave it permission to be seen. For years, Meghan Markle controlled the narrative. Every interview, every headline, every photo op was a piece of a larger story. The misunderstood outsider, the feminist icon, the survivor of royal cruelty who rebuilt her empire on her own terms. But that image doesn't survive when the people who helped you build it start walking away. This time, the backlash wasn't driven by tabloids or anonymous sources. It came from people who knew her, worked with her, protected her, built with her, and their stories, while coming from different corners, all started to echo the same thing. Meghan didn't want partners, she wanted loyalty. Unquestioning, constant, and convenient. One former Spotify producer said she killed promising creative ideas because they didn't fit the narrative she'd already written in her head. A consultant for Archewell revealed she routinely ignored strategic advice, especially if it challenged her image. And a publicist, once quietly on Meghan's team, admitted they were pressured to blacklist journalists who dared to ask unscripted questions. But the most damning story was also the simplest. Gratitude didn't exist in her world, said a former staffer. It was all about control, not collaboration. As more voices came forward, the media began to shift. Outlets that once raced to publish glowing profiles suddenly slowed down. Some passed on features entirely. Behind the scenes, PR firms advised clients to keep their distance. Nobody wanted to be the next name associated with a narrative that was no longer working. And then there was Oprah's silence. No interviews, no statements, no Instagram captions. The same woman who once platformed Meghan's most vulnerable moment on global television didn't say a word when Perry took the mic. And in Hollywood, silence like that isn't passive, it's intentional. The woman who once seemed untouchable was starting to feel alone, not publicly exiled, but strategically avoided. And in a city built on alliances, the lack of defense can be louder than the attack. Meghan's image wasn't being attacked by critics, it was being abandoned by allies. It didn't happen overnight, it didn't need to. One by one, the signals started stacking. Poll numbers showed support for Harry and Meghan in the US had dropped more than 30% in a year. In the UK, public trust was already fractured, but this wasn't about approval ratings anymore. It was about alignment. Meghan's brand had gone from powerful to polarizing, and now platforms, sponsors, and collaborators were quietly backing away. Social media, once split down the middle, was shifting hard. Hashtags that used to trend in her defense were now flooded with memes, criticism, and cold comparisons. Side-by-side clips painted her as rehearsed, entitled, manipulative. Even fans who had defended her for years were falling silent, and silence is contagious. Archewell, once buzzing with media energy and nonprofit ambition, was slowing down. Internal projects were paused, hires were frozen, weekly budget reviews replaced expansion meetings. Sources close to the foundation said it wasn't just a PR storm, it was a financial reckoning. Investors were skittish, future deals were stalled. A brand once built on global empathy now felt radioactive, and behind closed doors, Meghan was spiraling. She fired off furious messages to Perry after the BET speech, accusing him of betrayal, of humiliating her, of damaging her family's legacy, but Perry didn't respond. Not then, not ever. And that silence, from him, from Oprah, from her own former collaborators, spoke louder than any viral headline. For years, Meghan had framed herself as a woman wronged by power structures. But now, the people who once protected her, housed her, funded her, helped her tell her story, and were no longer standing beside her. The story was shifting, not because of smear campaigns, but because too many people had lived the same version of it. Quiet manipulation, demands for loyalty. Control disguised as confidence. Even Hollywood, a place where image is everything, began treating her name like a warning. Executives whispered that working with her team felt like playing chess with a mirror. Nothing reflected back clearly. Everything was spin, and when a brand becomes harder to manage than it is to monetize, the industry doesn't cancel it. It just stops calling. This wasn't exile by force. It was something colder, more strategic. Meghan Markle wasn't being shouted down. She was being phased out, slowly, deliberately, one silence at a time. Tyler Perry didn't rant. He didn't accuse. He didn't even raise his voice. That's what made it lethal, because what he said wasn't just about Meghan, and it was about a pattern, a story too many people in her orbit had quietly lived through and never spoken about until he did. And once he did, the silence shattered. Meghan Markle wasn't being chased out by the press or shamed by the public. She was being left behind by the very people who had once made space for her. The fairy tale had already ended once, with a royal exit that sparked sympathy and spectacle. But this time, there was no palace to blame, no monarchy to point to, just silence from old allies, hesitation from investors, and a quiet industry. A shift that said, "We're done." No one forced her out, they just stopped showing up. And in Hollywood, a place built on loyalty, illusion, and quiet politics, that's the real exile. One you never see coming until every door closes at once. From The Crown, and now from the culture.